Amidst the roar of the waterfall, a lone man stands precariously on a weathered wooden ladder, his scarred, calloused hands touching ancient roots as if seeking an answer from the past. His dog, Cooper, suddenly stops, ears perked, body tense, staring into the dark shadows beneath the massive boulder. Why would a veteran who has lost everything risk his life to build a home exactly where the mountain is slated for demolition? The secret hidden inside a rusted tin box that Cooper just found will uncover a heartbreaking truth about a fallen brother that no one was ready for. What this man has endured will break your heart, but the bond between him and his dog might just restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. Gray smog choked the city as a relentless drizzle turned the concrete into a mirror for neon ghosts. The air tasted of exhaust and unfulfilled promises, a heavy shroud that pressed against the lungs of anyone seeking peace. In this urban labyrinth, time didn't flow. It stagnated, trapped between the towering walls of steel. Inside a cramped third-floor apartment that smelled of stale coffee and old newspapers, Arthur sat on the edge of a sagging mattress. At 45, he carried the kind of rugged handsomeness that looked as though it had been carved out of granite and then left to weather in a storm. His hair, a deep hazel, was cut short but was increasingly invaded by sharp streaks of silver at the temples, matching the thin, neatly trimmed beard that followed the sharp line of his jaw. Despite the weary slump of his shoulders, there was a coiled strength in his frame, a remnant of the soldier he had once been. He wore his uniform of civilian survival, a beige canvas jacket over a matching beige button-down shirt, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, but kept impeccably clean. His trousers were solid dark charcoal chinos, matte and rugged, tucked into sturdy brown leather boots that had walked more miles of desert sand than city pavement. Arthur was a man who looked like he was constantly preparing for a march that never began. His hazel eyes, once bright and sharp, now clouded by the restless shadows of post-traumatic stress disorder. Every sudden bang of a radiator or the screech of a bus's brakes outside sent a jolt of electricity through his spine, a phantom tracer fire from a war that refused to stay buried. To the world, he was just another laborer, a mason who worked with stone, because stones didn't talk back and they didn't scream when you broke them. But inside, Arthur was still in the valley, still hearing the echoes of mortar fire. His only anchor to the present sat at his feet. The German shepherd was a magnificent creature, a sable-coated guardian with a black saddle that looked like velvet against the tawny fur of his flanks. He wore no vest, no collar, and no bell. He was simply there, a silent shadow with amber eyes that held a quiet, ancient wisdom. The dog was his pulse, his perimeter watch. Whenever Arthur's breathing grew shallow or his hands began to shake, the dog would lean his heavy weight against Arthur's shin, a warm, furry reminder that the war was over, even if the peace hadn't arrived. The morning took a definitive turn toward the abyss when a manila envelope slid through the mail slot, its slap against the floor sounding like a gunshot. Arthur didn't move for a long time, watching the white rectangle as if it might explode. Finally, he stood, his charcoal chinos whispering against each other as he crossed the room. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter. Silas Vance, his brother in arms, the man who had dragged Arthur's bleeding body out of a kill zone 10 years ago, was gone. It wasn't a bullet that took him in the end, but a quiet, wasting illness that he had fought in solitude. Arthur felt a cold hollow open up in his chest, a vacuum that sucked the air right out of his lungs. Silas had been his North Star, the only other person who knew what the silence of the desert felt like. With trembling fingers, Arthur opened the accompanying letter. The paper was rough, smelling faintly of pine and tobacco. Silas's handwriting was a jagged crawl, the work of a man whose hands had forgotten how to hold a pen, but remembered how to hold a soul. The letter spoke of a place Silas had always dreamed of, a hidden canyon back in their home state, where a massive boulder stood guarded by the ancient roots of a tree that refused to die. "Arthur," the letter read, "I'm tired of the noise. I'm tired of seeing the faces of the boys we left behind in every flickering street lamp. I bought that land, the one with the rooted rock. I was going to build us a sanctuary there, a place where the stone is thick enough to drown out the sirens. I can't finish it, brother. My clock is ticking too loud now. Don't let me die again in this gray city. Go there, build the house under the rock, breathe with the stones, and let the creek wash the grit out of your head. The grief hit Arthur then, not as a sharp pain, but as a crushing weight that made the room spin. He slumped back onto the mattress, the letter clutched to his beige shirt. Silas was gone, and the city felt like a tomb designed for the living. He looked around his room, the empty cans, the dusty masonry tools, the life of a man who was merely waiting to disappear. He looked at the German shepherd, who had placed his chin on Arthur's knee, his amber eyes searching Arthur's face for a command. The dog sensed the shift. The air in the room had changed from the stagnant scent of depression to the sharp, ozone-like charge of a mission. Silas had given him one last order. It wasn't about a tactical objective. It was about survival. It was about a stone sanctuary where the moss and the roots provided the only camouflage they would ever need again. Arthur stood up, and for the first time in years, his movements were fluid and purposeful. He began to pack. He didn't have much: his tools, a few changes of clothes, and Silas's letter. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier packing a ruck. He threw his boots into a duffel bag, checked his canteen, and grabbed his heavy canvas jacket. He looked at the German shepherd, whose tail gave a single, tentative wag against the floor. "We're going, buddy," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. The dog immediately stood, his body tensing with an ancient instinctual readiness. He followed Arthur's heel with a precision that was baked into his DNA, moving as one with his master toward the door. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city in a humid, suffocating grip. Arthur climbed into his old, battered pickup truck, the engine groaning to life with a mechanical cough that would have normally made him flinch. Today, he just gripped the steering wheel, his hazel eyes fixed on the road ahead. He looked in the rearview mirror at the city shrinking behind them, the steel towers that looked like prison bars, the neon lights that flickered like tracers. He was leaving the battlefield of his mind and heading toward the only thing Silas promised could heal him: the rock, the water, and the silence. As they crossed the city limits, the German shepherd rested his head on the center console, his amber eyes watching the gray skyscrapers give way to the first hints of green on the horizon. Arthur reached out a scarred hand and scratched the dog behind the ears. This wasn't just a trip, it was a pilgrimage. He was a man with a dying wish to fulfill and a soul to reclaim. And for the first time since the war, he felt like he was finally going home. The mountain air was a sharp pine-scented blade that sliced through the lingering stench of city exhaust. Yet it offered no immediate comfort to Arthur's jagged nerves. As his battered pickup truck groaned to a final halt near the edge of a rushing, unnamed creek, the silence of the wilderness felt less like peace and more like a tactical vacuum. Arthur stepped out, his brown leather boots crunching on the dry summer earth, his hazel eyes immediately scanning the towering canopy for threats that his mind still insisted were there. He stood for a moment, a 45-year-old silhouette of weathered strength, his hazel hair catching the unfiltered sunlight to reveal the sharp silver streaks at his temples. He was still wearing his uniform of survival, the beige canvas jacket, though now unzipped against the humid mountain heat, and a beige button-down shirt that clung to his back with the sweat of the long drive. His solid dark charcoal chino pants, rugged and matte, were already dusted with the fine, pale silt of the Ozarks as he navigated the uneven terrain. At his side, the German shepherd hopped down from the cab, his sable coat shimmering and his amber eyes instantly locked onto his master, waiting for the first perimeter check. It took them nearly an hour of trekking through the dense underbrush, following the jagged directions Silas had left behind, before they finally found the site. The boulder was more magnificent and more daunting than the letter had described. It was a massive moss-draped monolith that seemed to have been dropped by a titan, held in place by a labyrinth of ancient tree roots that wrapped around its gray skin like the veins of the earth itself. Below the overhang was a natural hollow, a cool, dark sanctuary carved by eons of wind, situated just high enough above the rocky creek to stay dry. But as Arthur stepped closer, a cold roll of dread turned in his chest. Bright neon orange spray paint marred the ancient stone. A giant X sat dead center on the rock face, and a series of survey stakes with fluttering plastic ribbons lined the bank. A logging company had marked this territory for demolition to make way for a heavy-haul road. The stone sanctuary Silas had dreamed of was scheduled to be pulverized into gravel. A surge of white-hot anger, familiar and dangerous, flared in Arthur's gut, but he forced it down into a cold, tactical clarity. If he was going to save this place, he had to make it a residence, a legal homestead, before the heavy machinery arrived. He didn't have months, he had days. He bypassed the fatigue in his limbs and reached for the heavy pickaxe in his gear pile. As he swung the first blow into the earth to clear the foundation, the ring of steel against flint ignited a flashpoint in his brain. For a split second, he wasn't in the mountains. He was back in a sun-scorched trench, the smell of cordite filling his nose, the sound of distant shouting echoing in the wind. His breath hitched, his hazel eyes glazing over as the phantom shadows of the valley closed in. The German shepherd sensed the shift instantly. He didn't bark. He moved with the surgical precision of a trained canine, stepping into Arthur's space and firmly hucking his snout against Arthur's scarred hand, which was gripping the pickaxe handle with white-knuckled intensity. The physical contact, the warmth of the dog's fur, and the steady weight of his presence acted as a living anchor, dragging Arthur back from the abyss of the past. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, looking down into the dog's amber eyes. "Thanks, boy," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the creek. He wiped the sweat from his silver-streaked beard and adjusted his beige shirt. He couldn't afford to lose his mind. He had a dying wish to keep. The labor was grueling and rhythmic, a brutal penance under the summer sun. Arthur worked with the intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shadow, hauling flat river stones from the creek bed until his muscles screamed. By mid-afternoon, a young man appeared from the tree line, startled by the sight of a grizzled veteran working like a possessed man. This was Caleb Miller, a junior surveyor for the timber company. Caleb was in his early 20s, lanky and sunburned, with a shock of unruly red hair peeking out from under a sweat-stained baseball cap. His pale skin was dusted with freckles, and he wore a neon yellow safety vest that looked absurdly bright against the deep greens of the forest. He carried a high-tech surveying transit on his shoulder, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. Caleb was a kid who viewed the forest as a series of numbers on a spreadsheet, someone who hadn't yet learned that some places were sacred. "Hey, you can't be up here, mister," Caleb called out, his voice cracking slightly as he took in Arthur's imposing frame and the silent, watchful German shepherd. "This whole sector is marked for clearing. We're bringing the dozers up the ridge next week." Arthur didn't stop his work. He placed a heavy stone onto the rising wall, the muscles in his forearms bulging. He finally turned, his hazel eyes boring into the younger man with a gaze that had seen things Caleb couldn't imagine. "I'm the owner of this parcel," Arthur said, his tone as hard as the granite he was stacking. "And I'm building a home. That makes this a construction site, not a timber lot. You tell your bosses they'll need a court order to move me." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the German shepherd, who gave a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the air. The young surveyor didn't have the stomach for a confrontation and retreated into the woods, leaving Arthur alone with the silence. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Arthur's body began to protest. His back was a map of fire, and his hands were raw, yet he refused to stop. He lit a single lantern, the flickering yellow light casting long, dancing shadows against the boulder's roots. Every stone he laid was a silent prayer for Silas, a way to compress the chaos of his PTSD into something solid and immovable. When the panic tried to rise again, triggered by the hoot of an owl that sounded too much like the whistle of an incoming flare, the dog was there. The German shepherd would nudge his arm or let out a short, sharp bark to break the cycle of the flashback, forcing Arthur to focus on the tangible texture of the stone and the cool evening breeze. By midnight, the first 2 feet of the southern wall were complete. Arthur slumped against the massive rock, his charcoal chinews covered in mud and stone dust, his beige shirt drenched in sweat. He was exhausted beyond measure, but for the first time in 10 years, the voices in his head were quieted by the sheer weight of physical toil. He reached out and pulled the German shepherd close, the dog's tawny fur soft against his arm. They were under the rooted rock now, the ancient tree above them, standing guard as it had for centuries. Arthur looked at the neon X on the stone and felt a grim satisfaction. He wasn't just building a house. He was digging a trench for a war of a different kind. He closed his eyes, the sound of the creek finally washing over him like a benediction, knowing that tomorrow the pickaxe would fall again, striking deep into the earth and even deeper into the pain he was finally learning to face. The morning light arrived not with a golden glow, but with a heavy, oppressive humidity that seemed to anchor the very mist to the floor of the canyon. Arthur awoke on a bed of pine boughs tucked deep under the overhang of the rooted rock, his muscles stiff from the previous day's brutal labor. Yet his mind was unusually clear, stripped of the static that usually filled his head in the city. He dressed with the deliberate precision of a soldier preparing for a long patrol, pulling on his beige button-down shirt and securing his beige canvas jacket, though the summer heat was already beginning to radiate from the damp stones. His solid dark charcoal chino pants were stained with the dried mud of the creek, the fabric showing its rugged durability as he checked his boots and whistled lowly for the German shepherd. The dog was already awake, his sable coat damp with dew, and his amber eyes tracking a squirrel in the high branches. There was no vest or collar to restrain him. He moved as a free extension of Arthur's own will. They spent the first hours of the day reinforcing the base of the southern wall, stacking heavy river stones, with a rhythmic intensity that served as Arthur's only meditation. The silence was eventually broken not by the roar of machinery, but by the soft, rhythmic thud of a walking stick against the earth. Arthur reached for his masonry trowel, his hazel eyes narrowing as he turned to face the intruder, his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance. Emerging from the emerald shadows of the tree line was a woman who looked as though she had been fashioned from the very timber and soil of the mountains. This was Clara Vance, Silas's maternal aunt, and the matriarch of the valley's dwindling original families. She appeared to be in her late 60s, her skin weathered into a map of fine lines and deep grooves that spoke of decades spent under the sun and wind. Her hair was a striking, untamed silver, pulled back into a thick braid that hung over a shoulder, draped in a faded denim work shirt. She was tall but slightly stooped, and her movements possessed a deliberate grace that commanded respect. Her eyes were a piercing sky blue, sharp enough to see through the psychological armor Arthur had spent years perfecting. She carried a heavy wicker basket in one hand and a sturdy oak staff in the other, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable authority that even the German shepherd acknowledged with a respectful tilt of his head. "You have Silas's eyes," Clara said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of the hills. "He wrote to me about you before the end, said you were the only one who could understand why a man would want to live under a rock instead of a roof." Arthur stood slowly, wiping the stone dust from his charcoal chinos, his silver-streaked beard catching the light. He didn't offer a smile, he had forgotten how, but he nodded in recognition. Clara didn't wait for an invitation. She walked to the rising wall and ran a gnarled hand over the stones Arthur had laid. "Most folks in town think you're just another broken soldier looking for a place to hide. They call you the madman of the ridge. But I know better. Silas wanted this to be a sanctuary, and you're the one building the altar." She reached into her basket and pulled out a thermos of hot coffee and a bundle of thick homemade bread, placing them on a flat stone. "I don't care for the timber company. They've been trying to buy my land since the day Silas went overseas. You stay here. You build. I'll make sure the law stays on the other side of the ridge for as long as I can." The peace Clara brought was short-lived. By mid-afternoon, the air turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the atmospheric pressure dropped so sharply that Arthur's ears began to pop. A summer storm was brewing, the kind that turned mountain creeks into killing floors in a matter of minutes. The first cracks of thunder sounded like heavy artillery, vibrating through the massive boulder above them and sending a momentary spike of adrenaline through Arthur's heart. He looked at the German shepherd, whose ears were perked and body tense. Then a sound drifted over the rising wind, a panicked, rhythmic bleating. Across the creek, on a narrowing ledge beneath a crumbling limestone cliff, a dozen goats and a few young calves from a nearby farm were trapped. The water was rising with terrifying speed, turning from a clear stream into a churning, brown torrent of mud and debris. The animals were huddled together, the ledge disappearing beneath their hooves as the flash flood began to reclaim the banks. Arthur didn't hesitate. The mission-oriented part of his brain took command. He stripped off his beige jacket, revealing the sweat-soaked beige shirt beneath, and grabbed a coil of heavy hemp rope from his gear pile. The German shepherd was already at the water's edge, his amber eyes locked on the trapped animals. Stay back, boy!" Arthur shouted over the roar of the water. But the dog ignored the command, barking sharply as if to guide Arthur's attention to a fallen log that had jammed against a rock midstream. It was a precarious bridge, slick with moss and shivering under the weight of the flood. Arthur stepped onto it, his brown boots struggling for purchase, his charcoal chinos soaking through as the spray hit him. The German shepherd leaped first, his powerful sable body clearing the gap with a grace that defied the chaos. He landed on the far bank and immediately began herding the panicked goats away from the crumbling edge, his movements a blur of sable and black. Arthur followed, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt since his last tour of duty. He reached the ledge just as a section of it slid into the river with a sickening roar. He worked with a frantic tactical efficiency, looping the rope around the largest calf and signaling the dog to drive the smaller goats toward the only remaining path up the cliff. The water lashed at his waist, trying to pull his charcoal chinos and his body into the dark maw of the flood. For a moment, a large branch struck Arthur's shoulder, sending him stumbling into the freezing water. He felt the current take him, the roar of the river filling his ears like the scream of a jet engine. But then, a familiar weight clamped onto his arm. The German shepherd had lunged into the shallows, his teeth gripping Arthur's sleeve with a ferocity that matched the river's own. The dog planted his paws into the mud, his muscles bulging as he strained to pull his master from the grip of the tide. With a final agonizing heave, Arthur found his footing and scrambled back onto the ledge, gasping for air, his hand buried in the dog's tawny fur. Together, they guided the last of the livestock up a steep, muddy trail to the high ground where Clara was waiting, her face pale with worry. The rain fell in a solid wall of gray, but the danger had passed. Arthur stood at the top of the ridge, drenched and shivering, his beige shirt clinging to his frame, watching the creek below transform into a violent river of stone and timber. He saw the silhouettes of several men from the village, laborers and farmers who had come to check on their stock, standing on the opposite ridge. They had watched the entire rescue. They had seen the madman and his dog risk everything for a few head of cattle that didn't belong to them. No words were exchanged across the water, but the atmosphere had shifted. The suspicion that had hung over the ridge like a fog began to lift, replaced by a silent, hard-earned respect that bypassed the need for conversation. That night, after the storm had subsided into a gentle patter against the rooted rock, Arthur sat by a small, shielded fire. His charcoal chinos were drying, and the German shepherd lay beside him, the dog's chest rising and falling in a deep, rhythmic sleep. As Arthur stared into the embers, he noticed something in the shadows at the edge of his camp. He stood, his hand instinctively reaching for his trowel, but then he saw them. A stack of 3 bags of high-grade cement sat near the entrance, covered by a piece of heavy tarp. Beside them was a crate of fresh vegetables and a gallon of milk. There were no notes, no names, and no one in sight. The laborers of the valley had begun their own silent protest. They couldn't openly defy the timber company that provided their paychecks, but they could ensure that Arthur had the tools to finish what Silas had started. Under the protective embrace of the ancient roots, Arthur realized he was no longer a lone soldier in a hole. He was the center of a growing, invisible alliance of souls who were tired of losing their heritage. He reached out and scratched the German shepherd behind the ears, the dog's amber eyes opening briefly to acknowledge the bond that had just saved them both. The waterfall roared with a newfound ferocity, a continuous roll of distant thunder that vibrated through the very soles of Arthur's brown leather boots. The storm from the previous night had left the air crisp and charged with a primitive energy, the kind that whispered of rebirth and the relentless passage of time. Arthur stood by the edge of the rocky creek, watching the white foam churn against the ancient stones. He looked up at the massive, moss-covered boulder that served as both his burden and his sanctuary. The stone walls he had built were sturdy, but the upper reaches of the rock, where the thick ancient tree roots snaked across the stone, like the fingers of a sleeping giant, were still out of reach. He realized that to truly inhabit this space, to make it a home that honored Silas's memory, he had to climb. He had to face the height. He had to build a bridge between the solid earth and the canopy of the sky. Arthur spent the first hours of the morning scavenging for the right timber. He needed wood that was seasoned yet resilient, capable of bearing his weight without snapping under the pressure of his past. He found what he was looking for in a stand of wind-felled cedar further up the ridge. As he worked, the physical labor served as a steadying rhythm for his restless mind. He wore his beige button-down shirt, tucked neatly into his solid dark charcoal chino pants, the matte fabric flexing as he hauled the heavy logs back to the creek. The charcoal chinos, devoid of any denim textures or flashy rivets, were quickly becoming a second skin, stained with the honest grime of the mountains. Beside him, the German Shepherd was a constant tawny shadow. The dog moved with a silent, feline grace, his amber eyes never leaving Arthur for more than a few seconds. He wore no vest or collar, his sable coat blending seamlessly with the dappled sunlight of the forest floor. As Arthur began to notch the rungs of the ladder, a soft rustle in the ferns announced a visitor. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply waited, his hazel eyes narrowing as a young woman stepped into the clearing. This was Sarah Sadie Jenkins, the eldest daughter of the farmer whose livestock Arthur had rescued from the flood. Sarah was a woman of lean, wiry strength, appearing to be in her late 20s. Her hair was a wild mane of burnt copper, usually tied back with a piece of twine, and her skin was dusted with a constellation of freckles that stood out against her sun-warmed complexion. She wore a simple oversized flannel shirt and rugged work trousers, her movements echoing the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her entire life navigating these hills. She carried a small bundle of hand-forged iron spikes and a jar of rendered pine resin. "My father says a man building a ladder to the heavens shouldn't have to worry about his rungs slipping," she said, her voice a pleasant alto that harmonized with the rushing water. She was a woman of few words, her character defined by the calluses on her hands and the steady, unblinking way she looked at the world, a direct result of growing up as the primary caretaker of her family's remote homestead. With Sarah's silent assistance, the ladder took shape, a weathered wooden structure that looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself. It was 12 feet of raw cedar, tied together with the resin and the iron spikes she had brought. Once it was finished, Arthur leaned it against the massive boulder, right near the center where the roots were thickest. He looked at the ladder, and then he looked at the sky. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through his chest. For a man with post-traumatic stress disorder, height was a double-edged sword. It offered a tactical advantage, but it also left one exposed, a silhouette against the horizon for snipers that only existed in his memory. His hands began to shake, a fine tremor that started in his fingers and moved up to his shoulders. He felt the phantom weight of a rifle sling against his beige shirt, the ghost of a world he had tried to leave behind in the city. The German Shepherd sensed the internal storm immediately. The dog didn't bark. He simply walked to the base of the ladder and sat down, looking up at Arthur with a profound, unblinking trust. He nudged Arthur's leg with his snout, a firm, warm pressure that acted as a living anchor to the present moment. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand finding the soft fur behind the dog's ears. "I see you, buddy," he whispered, the dog's name a prayer for stability. He reached out and gripped the first rung. The wood was rough under his scarred palms, the natural texture providing a grip that no factory-made tool could match. He began to climb, each step a deliberate victory over the gravity of his fear. His dark charcoal chinos brushed against the cedar rungs, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the light, weathered wood. Halfway up, the roar of the waterfall seemed to intensify, the sound enveloping him until he was suspended in a world of white noise. He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Below him, the German Shepherd stood at the base of the ladder, his head tilted back, his amber eyes following every movement of his master. The The dog's unwavering gaze was a tether, a reminder that Arthur wasn't alone in the heights. He looked out over the ridge, and for the first time, he didn't see a kill zone or a landing strip. He saw the rolling green waves of the Ozarks, the silver ribbon of the creek, and the way the mist danced between the ancient trees. He reached the top of the ladder and stretched out a hand to touch the ancient roots that snaked across the rock. They were warm from the sun, pulsing with a slow, geologic life that made his own worries seem fleeting. Standing there, precariously balanced between the stone and the sky, Arthur began the work of clearing the debris from the rock's roof. He moved with a newfound fluidness, his beige canvas jacket providing a buffer against the spray of the waterfall. He tucked Silas's letter into his inner pocket, feeling the crinkle of the paper against his chest. Every handful of moss he cleared, every dead branch he removed, felt like a layer of the city's smog being scrubbed from his soul. He was no longer just a mason or a soldier. He was a gardener of the stone, a curator of the sanctuary Silas had envisioned. The harmony between the man, the dog, the architecture of the rock, and the wild, untamed nature around them was absolute. It was a symphony of survival and grace, a moment where the jagged edges of his mind finally began to smooth. As the afternoon light began to fade into a soft golden amber, Arthur climbed down the ladder, his movement slow and tired, but devoid of the previous tremor. Sarah had long since departed, leaving the resin and the spikes behind as a silent offering of respect. He reached the bottom and was immediately greeted by the German shepherd, who leaned his heavy weight against Arthur's legs, his tail giving a single, satisfied wag. Arthur sat on a flat mossy rock near the campfire, the heat of the flames, a welcome companion as the evening chill began to settle in. He looked at the ladder leaning against the boulder, a wooden spine that connected his new home to the heavens. He realized that life, much like building this sanctuary, was a series of precarious steps. You could only climb one rung at a time, and you had to trust that the dog at the bottom and the memory of a friend would catch you if you fell. Under the shadow of the rooted rock, amidst the roar of the water, Arthur finally felt the first true spark of peace, a quiet warmth that the stones had promised him all along. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of Arthur's masonry hammer was the only symphony that mattered in the early morning stillness of the canyon. The heat had intensified, a shimmering haze that danced over the surface of the creek, but under the deep shadow of the rooted rock, the air remained cool and heavy with the scent of damp moss and ancient earth. Arthur was positioned high on the cedar ladder he had built, his brown leather boots braced firmly against the rungs. He was working on the upper eastern corner, where the stone wall met the natural curve of the boulder, a delicate intersection where the ancient tree roots acted as both a challenge and a structural guide. He wore his beige button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed by old scars, and his solid dark charcoal chino pants, which were now permanently dusted with the fine white powder of crushed limestone. The dark matte fabric of his chinos was a stark contrast to the sun-bleached wood of the ladder, a visual anchor in the swirling dappled light of the forest. Below him, the German shepherd, Cooper, was unusually restless. The dog wasn't scanning the perimeter for intruders today. Instead, his amber eyes were fixed on a deep, horizontal fissure in the rock face about 5 feet above the ground, his nose twitching with an intensity that Arthur couldn't ignore. Cooper let out a low, muffled huff, standing on his hind legs to scratch at the opening of the crevice. Arthur paused, his hammer suspended in midair, his hazel eyes tracking the dog's movements. "What is it, boy? You find a squirrel's hoard?" he muttered, his voice raspy but carrying a hint of genuine curiosity. He climbed down the ladder, the cedar rungs groaning under his weight, and knelt beside the dog. The fissure was narrow, a dark slit in the granite that seemed to reach back into the very heart of the mountain. It was choked with decades of leaf litter and spider webs, but as Arthur cleared the debris with the tip of his trowel, he felt the tool strike something that wasn't stone and wasn't wood. It was the dull, metallic thud of iron. With a grunt of effort, Arthur reached into the darkness, his fingers brushing against a cold, gritty surface. He pulled, and after a moment of resistance from the encroaching roots, a rusted tin box emerged into the light. The box was a relic of another era, a rectangular biscuit tin that had been eaten away by rust until its original colors were nothing but a memory of red and gold. It was sealed with a thick layer of pine resin, a crude but effective waterproofing that Silas must have applied years ago. Arthur sat back on his heels, his charcoal chinos crinkling as he rested the box on his knees. His heart began to hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't just a random discovery. This was a message. Cooper sat beside him, his sable coat brushing against Arthur's shoulder, his amber eyes watching the box with the solemnity of a witness. With the edge of his masonry knife, Arthur carefully chipped away the hardened resin and pried open the lid. The hinge screamed in protest, a sharp metallic sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a cry for help. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, was a collection of documents that smelled of thyme, tobacco, and the dry, sweet scent of cedar. There was a map, hand-drawn on a piece of heavy vellum, showing the canyon in intricate detail. But it wasn't a map of the surface. It was a map of the veins beneath. Silas had marked a point directly behind the rooted rock with a star, labeled in his jagged scrawl as the living breath. Arthur traced the line with a scarred finger, realizing it pointed to a hidden, underground aquifer, a natural spring that flowed deep within the mountain, shielded from the contamination of the world above. But the map was only the beginning. Beneath it lay a stack of folded papers, a list of names and military service numbers, some accompanied by Polaroid photographs that had begun to fade into sepia ghosts. As Arthur read the names, the true purpose of the stone sanctuary began to unfurl in his mind like a slow-burning fuse. These weren't just names, they were the forgotten. There was Liam Grizz O'Malley, a man Silas had described in the margins as a brother with a heart of gold but a mind full of glass, and Elias Thorne, who had lost his way in the neon and forgot the taste of the wind. The list contained over 30 veterans from across the tri-state area, men who were struggling with the same shadows that had nearly swallowed Arthur whole in the city. Silas hadn't intended this place to be a private tomb for two broken soldiers. He had envisioned a way station, a sanctuary of stone, where those who had been discarded by the society they served could come to find their footing. The rooted rock wasn't just a roof, it was a beacon, a place where the stone was thick enough to keep the demons at bay and the water was pure enough to wash away the grit of the war. The weight of the realization made Arthur's breath hitch. He felt the phantom pressure of Silas's hand on his shoulder, a silent command that had evolved from a dying wish into a living mission. He wasn't just building a house. He was preparing a fortress for an army of ghosts who were still very much alive. A shadow fell across the clearing, and Arthur looked up to see Clara Vance approaching, her silver braid glinting in the sunlight. She saw the rusted tin box and the papers spread out across Arthur's charcoal chinos, and a sad, knowing smile touched her weathered lips. She walked over with her oak staff, her piercing blue eyes softening as she looked at the photographs. "He spent 3 years putting that list together," Clara said softly, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Silas knew the war didn't end when the guns stopped. He knew men like you, and men like Liam over there, needed a place where the world couldn't find them until they were ready to be found." She pointed to the photograph of a man with a massive bushy beard and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. Liam was a man of 60, a veteran of a different jungle, whose hands were said to be as steady as a mountain, but whose spirit was as fragile as a bird's wing. He was a master carpenter who had disappeared into the woods years ago, unable to handle the noise of the modern world. Clara looked at Arthur, her gaze searching. Silas wanted a community of the quiet. He knew you were the only one strong enough to hold the walls up, while the rest of them learned how to breathe again. Arthur looked back at the map, his gaze fixing on the underground spring. He realized that the timber company's plan to blast the ridge wasn't just a threat to the trees, it was a threat to the very lifeblood of this sanctuary. If they destroyed the rock, they destroyed the water. If they destroyed the water, they destroyed the hope of every man on that list. A cold, hard resolve settled into his bones, a feeling of purpose that was sharper and more defined than anything he had felt in years. He wasn't just fighting for a memory anymore. He was fighting for the living. He looked at Cooper, who was now standing alert, his ears perked toward the ridge where the surveyors had been. The dog gave a low, rumbling growl, sensing the shift in his master's energy. Arthur began to fold the papers back into the oilcloth, his movements precise and careful. He tucked the rusted tin box into a hollow he had carved into the inner wall of the sanctuary, a secret place that only he and the dog knew. He stood up, brushing the stone dust from his solid dark charcoal chinos, his beige shirt damp with the exertion of the day. He felt taller, his shoulders more squared, the hazel of his eyes now burning with a clear, tactical light. The stone sanctuary was no longer a retreat. It was a headquarters. He looked at the massive roots of the tree above him and realized they weren't just holding the rock. They were reaching out, looking for others to protect. He picked up his masonry hammer, the weight of it familiar and right in his hand. There was so much more work to be done. Silas had provided the vision, and the mountain had provided the stone. But it was up to Arthur and his loyal sable companion to build the bridge that would bring the forgotten home. The summer heat had begun to yield to the first subtle whispers of autumn, painting the edges of the maple leaves in faint strokes of gold and crimson, but the work beneath the rooted rock never faltered. The stone sanctuary was no longer a mere dream of a dying man. It had become a physical reality, a sturdy fortress of granite and cedar that seemed to grow out of the mountain's very marrow. Arthur stood back from the southern wall, his hazel eyes tracking the level line of the latest course of stones. He was drenched in sweat, his beige button-down shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, while his solid dark charcoal chino pants were caked with a fine layer of gray mortar dust and silt from the creek. The rugged matte fabric of his chinos held up against the sharp edges of the rocks he hauled daily, tucked firmly into his worn brown leather boots. At his feet, the German shepherd sat with a regal stillness, his sable coat catching the late afternoon light and his amber eyes scanning the tree line with a protective intensity. The dog wore no vest, no collar, and no harness, yet he remained perfectly synchronized with Arthur's every breath. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his beige canvas jacket, which hung from a nearby root, and pulled out the rusted tin box he had found in the crevice. He unfolded the list of names Silas had left behind, the forgotten brothers who had survived the fire only to be lost in the fog of peace. With a heavy, hand-forged chisel and a wooden mallet, Arthur began the most sacred part of the construction. He didn't just want to build a house. He wanted to build a testament. He selected a large flat river stone at eye level near the entrance and, with a steady hand that finally lacked its usual tremor, he began to carve. The clink of metal against stone echoed through the canyon, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to summon the very spirits of the names he was inscribing. He started with Silas Vance, the letters deep and permanent. As he worked, the memories of the desert and the kill zones didn't trigger a panic. Instead, they flowed through the chisel and into the rock, being locked away where they could no longer hurt him. Every name was a story, a life that deserved to be remembered by more than just a government database. He was giving the stones a voice, turning the silent granite into a library of honor. Cooper stood by the ladder, his head tilted as if he too were listening to the stories the stones were beginning to tell. The sound of the chisel eventually drew others. It began with Elias Thorne, a man whose name was third on Silas's list. Elias appeared at the edge of the clearing just as the sun began to dip behind the ridge. He was a man in his late 50s, gaunt and whip-thin, with a nervous energy that made him look like a bird perpetually ready to take flight. His hair was a wild, snowy white, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, eyes that Silas had described as having forgotten the taste of the wind. He wore a frayed M65 field jacket that was several sizes too large and moved with a halting, uncertain gait. Beside him, leaning on a hand-carved cane, was Liam Grizz O'Malley, the master carpenter from the photographs in the tin box. Grizz was a mountain of a man, his chest as broad as a barrel, and his face almost entirely obscured by a massive grizzled beard that reached his sternum. Despite his size, he moved with a surprising, soft-footed grace, his presence bringing a sudden, heavy stillness to the camp. Arthur stopped his work, his hand resting on the cool stone where Silas's name was now engraved. He looked at the two men, his hazel eyes meeting theirs, in a silent recognition that bypassed the need for introductions. They were all part of the same shattered mirror. "Clara told us you were here," Grizz said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very roots above them. He looked at the walls, then at the carved names, his expression softening into something resembling awe. Silas always said you were the best mason in the unit. I see he wasn't exaggerating. Grizz stepped forward and placed a massive calloused hand on the stone. He didn't speak of his own trauma. He simply stood there, breathing with the rock. Elias, meanwhile, sat on a flat stone by the creek, his hands trembling slightly until Cooper walked over and rested his heavy sable head on the man's knee. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on Elias, offering a silent, grounding warmth that finally allowed the older veteran to let out a long, shuddering breath. As the evening chills settled into the canyon, Arthur built a small fire by the edge of the creek, the flames casting long, flickering shadows against the boulder's overhang. The three men sat in a semicircle, the silence between them comfortable and heavy with unspoken history. For the first time in 10 years, Arthur found himself speaking. He told them about the city, about the smog that felt like a shroud, and about the slap of the envelope through the mail slot. Elias spoke of the decades he had spent in the shadows, moving from town to town because the silence of a room was always too loud. Grizz shared his struggle with the wooden ghosts, the furniture he built but couldn't keep because every piece felt like a coffin for a part of himself he had left in the jungle. They shared stories that had been locked behind ribs for years, stories of brothers lost and promises broken. The words flowing out of them and into the flickering light of the fire. The stone sanctuary was no longer just Arthur's mission. It had become a communal hearth. Every few days, a new face would appear. Men and women who had served, some carrying tools, others carrying nothing but their own heavy silence. They began to help. Grizz took charge of the cedar rafters, his steady hands finally finding a purpose that didn't feel like a burden. Elias became the camp's scout, his nervous energy channeled into gathering firewood and clear spring water from the aquifer Arthur had tapped. Each new arrival brought a name, and Arthur would spend his evenings by the lantern light, carving those names into the walls. The house was becoming a mosaic of sacrifice. The X that the logging company had spray-painted on the rock was now almost entirely obscured by the rising stonework and the names of the fallen. They were building a fortress not of wood and wire, but of memory and bone. By the end of the month, the main structure was nearly complete. The rooted rock above provided a natural sloping roof that Arthur had reinforced with cedar shingles and stone slabs. Standing within the sanctuary, the air felt different, thicker, safer. The roar of the waterfall outside was a low, soothing hum, and the thick granite walls acted as a barrier against the chaotic vibrations of the world. Arthur sat on a hand-hewn bench Grizz had crafted, his solid dark charcoal chinos now permanently stained but intact, his beige shirt open at the collar. He looked at the German shepherd who was lying across the threshold like a living gatekeeper, his amber eyes reflecting the dying embers of the hearth. Arthur realized that Silas's dying Guyan had been far more profound than he had initially understood. This place wasn't meant to be a hiding spot for one man. It was a beacon of healing for an entire community of lost souls. The stones were finally speaking, and for the first time since the war, Arthur was able to listen without fear. Site 2026 01 12, 2026 at 0105, 2025 to 12:12. The July sun had transformed the canyon into a furnace, a shimmering bowl of heat where the air was thick enough to taste of molten stone and dry pine needles. The waterfall, usually a source of cool relief, now seemed to hiss as its spray evaporated before hitting the thirsty rocks below. Arthur moved with a slow, mechanical determination, his body a map of salt stains and burning muscle. He had discarded his beige canvas jacket hours ago, leaving it draped over a cedar branch, but he remained in his beige button-down shirt, the fabric plastered to his back like a second, suffocating skin. His solid dark charcoal chino pants, rugged and matte, were stiff with a combination of dried mud and the relentless white dust of the limestone he had been shaping. He felt the heat radiating from the dark fabric of his chinos, a heavy warmth that seeped into his bones as he knelt by the creek bed to heave a particularly massive slab of granite. He was 45, but in this light, with the silver at his hazel temples glinting like frost under a desert sun, he felt as old as the rooted rock itself. Beside him, the German shepherd was a silent sentinel of sable and black. The dog's tongue lolled, his breath coming in shallow, rapid pants, but his amber eyes never wavered from Arthur. He wore no vest or collar, his natural coat dusty, but his spirit as sharp as a razor, sensing the mounting toll the day was taking on his master. As Arthur stood, the massive granite slab clutched against his chest, the world suddenly tilted. The roar of the waterfall didn't fade. Instead, it warped, turning into the rhythmic, terrifying thrum of a helicopter's rotors. The lush green of the Ozarks began to bleed into a blinding, monochromatic tan. He wasn't standing by a creek in Missouri anymore. He was back in a parched wadi, the smell of cordite and scorched metal replacing the scent of pine. A sharp, searing pain exploded behind his hazel eyes, the telltale sign of heat stroke, and his knees buckled. The stone he carried fell with a muted thud into the silt, narrowly missing his boots. Arthur collapsed beside it, his face pressing into the damp earth at the water's edge. He tried to crawl toward the stream, but his limbs felt like lead, and the fever took hold, pulling him deep into a sun-drenched mirage where the ghosts of fallen brothers moved through the shimmering haze of a desert he had tried to forget. He lay there, drifting between worlds, while the relentless July sun continued to bake the canyon floor. The German shepherd moved instantly, his instincts bypassing the confusion of the moment. He huffed at Arthur's ear, his cold nose pressing against the burning skin of the veteran's neck, but Arthur didn't stir. Sensing the rising heat in Arthur's body, the dog began to dig. With a frantic, purposeful energy, he used his powerful front paws to buoy into the soft, silty bank of the creek. He worked with a surgical precision, carving a shallow ranch, a narrow channel that allowed the cold, mountain-fed water to bleed away from the main stream and flow directly over the place where Arthur lay. The icy water pooled around Arthur's neck and shoulders, soaking his beige shirt and the waistband of his charcoal chinos, providing a desperate, cooling lifeline against the rising fever. The dog then lay his wet, heavy body across Arthur's legs, his tawny fur acting as a damp compress, while his amber eyes scanned the ridge for the help he knew was miles away. Realizing that the water alone wouldn't save his master, the German shepherd stood and looked toward the tree line. He knew the path. He knew the rhythm of the supplies. Every few days, at a designated clearing nearly a mile away, the woman with the silver braid would leave the crates of food and stone-cutting tools. With a final, sharp bark that echoed uselessly against the canyon walls, the dog turned and vanished into the brush. He ran with a desperate, lung-bursting speed, his sable coat a blur through the thick ferns and jagged limestone outcroppings. He didn't stop for the scent of deer or the lure of the shade. He moved like a soldier on a desperate courier run, his amber eyes focused on the edge of the woods where the logging road began. He reached the clearing just as a dusty white pickup truck pulled into the grass. Mark Halloway, a young man in his early 20s who often assisted Clara with the heavier deliveries, was the first to step out. Mark was tall and rangy, with a shock of sandy hair and a face that was still holding on to its youthful softness. He was a local boy, a cousin of Sarah Jenkins, and he wore a pair of faded dungarees and a t-shirt that had seen better days. He was a man of quiet competence, a mechanic by trade who had been shaped by a life of hard work and the steady, unyielding values of the mountain people. He was skeptical of the man under the rock, but out of respect for Clara, he did what was asked. Beside him, Clara Vance climbed out of the passenger side, her silver braid glinting and her blue eyes immediately narrowing as the German shepherd skidded into the clearing, his chest heaving and his amber eyes wide with a frantic, pleading intelligence. "Cooper, where's Arthur?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with an immediate maternal dread. The dog didn't wait for a second command. He didn't approach the food crates. Instead, he lunged toward Clara, his teeth gently but firmly catching the sleeve of her denim shirt. He yanked her toward the trail, letting out a low, urgent whine. Mark Halloway reached for a heavy wrench in the back of the truck, his instincts sensing a threat, but Clara held up a gnarled hand. "No, Mark. He's leading us. Something happened?" The two of them followed as the German shepherd turned and raced back into the forest, frequently stopping and looking back to ensure they were keeping up. The dog led them through the Ganj Jaw, the treacherous, jagged rock gardens that Arthur usually avoided, cutting the distance in half. The German Shepherd leaped over fallen logs and navigated narrow ledges with a grace that left the younger man struggling to keep pace, his amber eyes constantly checking the trail behind him. They found Arthur at the base of the rooted rock, the narrow channel of water the dog had dug still gurgling around his shoulders. He was still caught in the grip of the desert mirage, his fingers twitching against the silt as if searching for a phantom radio. Clara knelt beside him, her cool hands pressing against his forehead, while Mark quickly moved to help. "Heat stroke," Clara whispered, her blue eyes dark with worry. "The dog. Mark, look at the water. The dog saved him." They worked together to move Arthur into the deep, cool shade of the sanctuary, using wet cloths to bring his temperature down. Throughout it all, the German Shepherd never left Arthur's side. He sat by his master's head, his sable body a protective shield, his amber eyes watching Clara and Mark with a wary but grateful intensity. He had done his duty. He had held the perimeter and brought the reinforcements. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting the canyon into a soft, bruised purple, Arthur's hazel eyes finally fluttered open. The fever had broken, leaving him weak and shivering, but the desert ghosts had receded into the shadows of his mind. He looked up to see Clara's weathered face and Mark Halloway's curious sand-colored gaze. He felt the dampness of his beige shirt and the heavy, cool weight of his dark charcoal chinos. Then, he felt the warm, wet tongue of the German Shepherd against his hand. He reached out, his scarred fingers burying themselves in the dog's thick, tawny fur. You brought them," Arthur rasped, his voice a dry whisper. The dog let out a soft, satisfied huff and rested his chin on Arthur's chest. Clara smiled, a rare, beautiful expression that lit up her blue eyes. "He's more than a dog, Arthur. He's a brother. And from now on, you won't be building these walls alone." As the stars began to poke through the canopy, the stone sanctuary felt less like a fortress and more like a home, a place where the trial of the summer had forged a bond that no logging company could ever hope to break. The dawn did not break with the usual chorus of birdsong. Instead, it was heralded by a low, mechanical growl that vibrated through the very marrow of the rooted rock. The earth itself seemed to shiver as the heavy-haul logging trucks and a massive yellow D9 bulldozer groaned their way up the narrow ridge path, their steel treads crushing the ferns and wildflowers Arthur had worked so hard to preserve. Arthur stood at the entrance of the stone sanctuary, his hazel eyes narrowed against the rising dust, his body a silent monument of defiance. He was dressed in his beige button-down shirt, the collar open to catch the morning breeze, and his solid dark charcoal chino pants, which were now caked with the honest grime of his labor, but remained sturdy and sharp in their silhouette. He had opted not to wear his canvas jacket, preferring the freedom of movement as he watched the steel monsters halt just 50 yards from his doorstep. Beside him, the German Shepherd was a statue of sable and black. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on the lead vehicle, his ears perked, but he remained eerily silent, sensing the heavy, historical weight of the moment. He wore no vest, no harness, and no collar. He was simply a sentinel of the mountain, a living shadow at Arthur's side. A sleek silver SUV parked behind the bulldozer, and from it emerged a man who looked like the personification of the world Arthur had tried to leave behind. This was Sterling Grant, the lead legal counsel for Blackwood Timber. Grant was in his late 50s, his hair a perfectly manicured silver that matched the sharp slate-gray suit he wore despite the humidity of the canyon. He carried a leather briefcase like a shield and moved with the clinical, detached confidence of a man who believed that everything in the world had a price tag. His eyes were like flint, hard, gray, and devoid of the warmth of the woods. Grant looked at the stone walls and the ancient tree roots with a faint curl of his lip, as if the very concept of a sanctuary built from the earth was an affront to his sensibilities. Beside him stood a few grim-faced security contractors, their presence a silent threat of the violence the corporation was willing to employ to clear the X from the map. "Mr. Miller," Grant began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that cut through the mechanical hum. "I am here to inform you that your period of illegal occupation has ended. This parcel is corporate property, and we have a signed demolition order. You have 10 minutes to gather your belongings and your dog before we commence clearing the site." Arthur didn't move. He didn't reach for a tool or raise his voice. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his beige shirt and pulled out the rusted tin box he had found in the crevice. He looked at Grant, his hazel eyes burning with a quiet, tactical fire. "This land isn't just timber and dirt, Mr. Grant," Arthur said, his voice carrying over the roar of the waterfall. "It's a ledger, and the debt this country owes to the names on this list is far greater than your company's profit margin." Arthur stepped aside, gesturing to the speaking stones he had carved. The sunlight hit the names: Silas Vance, Elias Thorne, Grizz O'Malley, the deep permanent grooves in the granite glowing in the morning light. As Grant prepared a dismissive rebuttal, the sound of more engines drifted up the ridge. This time, they weren't the growls of corporate machinery. They were the rattling, familiar coughs of old farm trucks and battered sedans. One by one, the vehicles of the valley pulled into the clearing, forming a haphazard barricade between the bulldozer and the sanctuary. Clara Vance was the first to emerge, her silver braid a banner of defiance. Behind her came Sarah Jenkins, the farmer's daughter, and Mark Halloway, the young mechanic who had helped save Arthur's life during the heat wave. But they were not alone. There were dozens, then scores of people, laborers in flannel shirts, elderly women with determined expressions, and children holding handfuls of wildflowers. Among the crowd was a new face, a man who represented the moral marrow of the community. This was Father Michael O'Shea, the local priest who had served the valley for over 40 years. Father O'Shea was in his mid-70s, his face a landscape of kindness and iron-willed conviction. He had a shock of snow-white hair and a gentle, lilting Irish accent that could soothe a grieving widow or rattle the windows of a crooked politician. He wore a simple black cassock and a silver cross that glinted against the forest green. O'Shea wasn't just a man of God. He was a man of the people, and his presence signaled that this wasn't just a property dispute. It was a battle for the soul of the mountain. He walked to the center of the clearing, his oak staff thudding against the earth, and stood beside Arthur. "You speak of law, Mr. Grant," Father O'Shea said, his voice deceptively soft, yet carrying to every corner of the clearing. "But the law of the heart and the law of the land are often at odds. These stones bear the names of men who gave everything so that you could sit in your air-conditioned offices. This is a sanctuary for the broken, and you'll find that the people of this valley don't take kindly to desecration." As he spoke, the community began to move. They didn't shout, they didn't throw stones. Instead, they formed a human fence. Children sat on the mossy ground. Veterans like Elias Thorne and Grizz O'Malley stood shoulder to shoulder with young men like Mark, and the elderly women linked arms. They created a living barrier around the rooted rock, a wall of flesh and spirit that the bulldozer could not cross without crushing the very people the company claimed to serve. The German shepherd moved through the crowd like a thread of sable silk, nudging hands and leaning his weight against the legs of the children, his amber eyes providing a calm, grounding presence that kept the tension from boiling over into violence. He was the silent coordinator of the peace, a reminder that the sanctuary was a place of healing, not hatred. Sterling Grant looked at the human shield, his flinty eyes flickering with the first signs of genuine doubt. He looked at the cameras being held up by the younger townspeople, realizing that a video of a bulldozer crushing a priest and a group of war veterans would be a public relations nightmare from which Blackwood Timber would never recover. He looked at the speaking stones and then at Arthur, who stood at the center of the storm, his dark charcoal chinos and beige shirt, a symbol of the quiet, immovable strength of the mountain itself. Grant snapped his briefcase shut, the sound a sharp final report in the stillness. "This isn't over, Miller," he hissed, though the conviction had left his voice. "We will be back with the sheriff and a formal injunction." But as he climbed back into his silver SUV, everyone in the clearing knew the truth. The corporate machine had flinched. The power of the Lin Hon Lak Loai, the lost souls of the valley, had proven more resilient than steel treads and legal jargon. The trucks began to back down the ridge, their mechanical growl fading into the distance, replaced once again by the triumphant roar of the waterfall. Arthur stood amidst his neighbors, the German shepherd sitting loyally at his heel. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man who had finally found his tribe. Under the shadow of the ancient roots, amidst the tears and the quiet handshakes of the townspeople, the stone sanctuary was no longer just a house. It was a testament to the fact that when the forgotten stand together, the world has no choice but to remember. The silver light of a hunter's moon washed over the canyon, turning the rushing creek into a ribbon of molten mercury and casting long, intricate shadows of the ancient tree roots against the face of the stone sanctuary. For the first time since Arthur had stepped out of his battered pickup truck weeks ago, the air was devoid of the mechanical growl of bulldozers or the tense electric hum of an impending confrontation. The legal victory, won not with iron, but with the collective heart of the valley, had left a profound, hallowed silence in its wake. The stone walls, now fully realized and rising 6 meters by 4 meters to meet the natural curve of the boulder, stood as a testament to a promise kept. Site 2026 Darijo 1-12. The wooden door, crafted from the cedar Grizz had provided, sat snugly in its frame, its grain glowing faintly in the firelight. Arthur sat on a flat, moss-covered rock near the hearth he had built just outside the threshold, his body finally beginning to uncoil from years of high-alert survival. He was dressed in his beige button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his solid dark charcoal chino pants, which had become the rugged skin of his new life, Site 2025 12-12, 2026 0105. The dark matte fabric of his chinos was stained with the salt of his sweat and the dust of the speaking stones. Yet, they looked more dignified than any uniform he had ever worn. Beside him, the German shepherd lay in a state of blissful repose, his sable coat shimmering under the moon, his black saddle a dark velvet patch against his tawny flanks. Site 2026 0105 2026 01-12. The dog wore no vest or collar. He was a free spirit who had chosen this ridge, his amber eyes now half closed in a rare moment of luxury. Site 2026 0105 2026 Barrera 1-12. Arthur reached into the deep pocket of his beige canvas jacket, which rested nearby on a hand-carved bench, and his fingers brushed against a cold, rectangular object he had sworn never to touch again. It was a Honor harmonica, its chrome plating pitted with age and the wear of a dozen combat zones. For years, this instrument had been a source of agony, a trigger that summoned the ghosts of Silas and the others, who used to sing along to its mournful tunes in the dark of the desert nights. To Arthur, the harmonica was a vessel of the fallen, its notes too heavy with the weight of the boys who didn't come home. But as he looked at the names carved into the stone walls behind him, names that were no longer just memories but part of the foundation of a sanctuary, he felt a shift in the wind. Site 2026 Zawarasmin San 12. The UUAT, the deep, stagnant melancholy that had choked his soul in the city, had been washed away by the labor of his hands and the loyalty of the dog. He brought the harmonica to his lips, the cool metal tasting of history and salt. He took a long, steady breath, his hazel eyes fixed on the flickering embers of the campfire. The first note was tentative, a low, vibrato hum that seemed to test the air of the canyon. It didn't sound like a funeral march. It sounded like the mountain itself was exhaling. He began to play a slow, melodic folk tune, a song Silas used to whistle when the world felt like it was falling apart. The music rose through the ancient tree roots, intertwining with the roar of the waterfall and the rustle of the autumn leaves. It was a Bon Hoa Tao, a symphony of the wild and the redeemed. Site 2026 0112. The German shepherd opened his amber eyes, his ears perking at the sound. He didn't bark or growl. Instead, he let out a soft, satisfied huff and rested his chin on Arthur's boot, his body a warm weight against the dark charcoal chinos. As the music drifted down the ridge, it reached the ears of those who had become the silent guardians of the rock. Thomas Tommy Reed, a local boy who had been watching the perimeter from a distance, stepped into the edge of the firelight. Tommy was 19, a lanky youth with a face full of earnest curiosity and a shock of wheat-colored hair that always seemed to be in his eyes. He was the youngest son of a family that had lived in the valley for 5 generations, and he wore a pair of oversized denim overalls and a flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke. Tommy was a boy who spoke more with his eyes than his mouth, his character defined by a quiet, watchful kindness that made him the perfect apprentice for someone like Arthur. He carried a small bundle of dry hickory, a silent offering for the fire. He sat down a few yards away, not wanting to disturb the magic of the moment, his youthful presence a bridge between Arthur's past and the valley's future. Arthur didn't stop playing. He felt the tension in his silver-streaked temples finally dissolve, the music acting as a conduit for the grief he had been afraid to feel. Site 2026-01-12. He played for Silas, for the names on the wall, and for the man he used to be. The harmonica's song wasn't a cry of pain anymore. It was a declaration of existence. Every breath he drew through the reeds felt like it was cleaning the soot of the city from his lungs. The shadows of the desert, the phantoms of the war, and the Kwai Vat, Kwa Fap Li seemed to fade into the silver mist of the creek. Site 2026 12. The stone sanctuary was no longer just a project. It was a living, breathing entity, a place where the stone was warm and the music was free. The German shepherd eventually fell into a deep sleep, his breathing a steady rhythm that matched the flow of the water. Arthur pulled the harmonica away and looked up at the stars, which burned with a fierce, cold brilliance above the Ozarks. He felt a sense of Thean then, a peace so profound it almost felt heavy. Site 2026-01-12. He realized that the sanctuary wasn't just built to keep the world out. It was built to find the music within. He looked at the ladder leaning against the rock, its rungs reaching toward the sky, and he knew that the climb was far from over, but the fear of falling had vanished. He reached out and scratched the dog behind the ears, the sable fur soft under his scarred fingers. "We did it, buddy," he whispered into the night. The dog didn't move, but his tail gave a single, rhythmic thump against the earth, a final note in the symphony of their first night of true peace. Under the Di Nguyen Qua Nhung Vi Sao, Arthur finally allowed himself to close his eyes and simply be a man, home at last, beneath the roots of the ancient rock. The Ozark winter approached not with a roar, but with a silver hush that turned the breath of the canyon into a soft, ethereal mist. The ancient tree roots, now dusted with the first delicate frost of the season, gripped the massive boulder with a renewed intensity, as if shielding the stone sanctuary from the impending cold. The waterfall had slowed to a rhythmic, ice-fringed pulse, its song more melodic and less chaotic than the summer torrents Arthur had faced when he first arrived. Arthur stood by the heavy cedar door of his home, looking out over the ridge. At 45, the jagged edges of his soul had finally begun to smooth, much like the river stones he had spent months polishing. His hazel hair, now prominently streaked with silver at the temples, caught the pale morning light, and his thin silver beard was neatly trimmed against the sharp line of his jaw. He wore his beige canvas jacket over a clean beige button-down shirt, a practical armor that felt lighter now than it ever had in the city. His solid dark charcoal chino pants, though worn at the knees from hours of labor, remained a symbol of his grounded, steady presence. Beside him, the German shepherd sat in a posture of regal patience, his sable coat thick and healthy for the winter, his black saddle a dark contrast against the tawny fur of his sides. The dog wore no vest or collar. He was the heartbeat of the rock, his amber eyes fixed on the distant trail where the forest met the logging road. They had been waiting for this moment, though Arthur hadn't known it until the air changed. The German shepherd stood first, his ears perking toward a sound that Arthur's human ears couldn't yet detect. A low, rhythmic thud of boots, tired, dragging boots, echoed through the ferns. Emerging from the shadows of the hemlocks was a young man who looked like a ghost of Arthur's own past. This was Benjamin Ben Garrett, a veteran in his late 20s, who looked as though he had been hollowed out by a war that refused to end just because he had returned home. Ben was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp against skin that was pale and lacked the warmth of the sun. He had a shock of messy dark hair and eyes that were a haunted, restless gray, eyes that had seen too many horizons and not enough homes. He wore a frayed, oversized military field jacket and carried a single tattered rucksack over his shoulder. his movements hesitant, as if he expected the very ground to give way beneath him. He was a man drifting in the fog, carrying a crumpled piece of paper that Clara Vance had given him at a roadside diner miles away. The German Shepherd didn't growl. Instead, he walked forward with a slow, welcoming wag of his tail, his amber eyes reflecting a deep, instinctual empathy. He reached Ben first, leaning his heavy tawny head against the young soldier's shaking hand. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat as the warmth of the dog seeped through his numb fingers. He looked down at the sable-coated guardian and felt a strange, sudden crack in the icy wall around his heart. Arthur stepped forward, his charcoal chinos whispering against the dry leaves, his hazel eyes meeting Ben's gray ones with a gaze that held no judgment. Only the profound recognition of a brother who had traveled the same dark road. There was no need for tactical reports or explanations. The mountain and the dog had already told Arthur everything he needed to know. "You're late, son," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was as comforting as the heat of a hearth. He reached out a scarred hand and placed it firmly on Ben's shoulder, a gesture of grounding strength. Ben looked at the stone sanctuary, the carved names of the fallen glowing in the morning light, the ancient roots providing a roof of living history, and his knees finally began to tremble. The weight of his rucksack and the weight of his memories seemed to double in an instant. He looked at Arthur, a man who had built a temple out of his own pain, and for the first time in years, Ben felt the possibility of a tomorrow that didn't involve a battlefield. I was told there was a place," Ben rasped, his voice thin and fragile. Arthur nodded, leading him toward the flat, sun-warm rocks near the entrance where the creek's song was most soothing. "Sit down, son. The stone is warm here," Arthur said, his tone a perfect balance of authority and tenderness. "In this place, we breathe with the stone and we heal with the stream. Silas built the vision, I built the walls, but the mountain provides the peace." The German Shepherd lay down at Ben's feet, his sable body a warm anchor that refused to let the young man drift away again. As the three of them sat together under the shadow of the rooted rock, the cycle of sacrifice and isolation was finally broken by a new cycle of rebirth and unconditional love. The sanctuary had become more than a house. It was a living legacy of peace that had been forged in the fire of PTSD and tempered by the loyalty of a dog. Arthur looked at the names on the wall, Silas, Grizz, Elias, and he knew they were watching, their spirits finally at rest, because the speaking stones were now being heard by the ones who needed them most. The unconditional love between the man and his dog had created a ripple effect that had saved an entire community and was now reaching out to save a stranger. As the first few flakes of winter snow began to drift down through the canopy, Arthur felt a profound, hallowed peace. He realized that his mission wasn't just to build a home for himself, but to be the gatekeeper for the forgotten, a lighthouse for the lost souls who were searching for the warmth of the stone. The story of the man under the rock and the angel dog would be told in the valley for generations, a mythological tale of how a broken soldier used the fragments of his past to build a future for others. It was a testament to the fact that healing is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. As Arthur watched Ben take his first deep, untroubled breath in the mountain air, he reached down and scratched the German Shepherd behind the ears, the dog's tail giving a rhythmic thump against the warm stone. Under the legacy of the stars and the protective embrace of the ancient roots, Arthur was no longer a soldier in a hole. He was a master of his own destiny, standing at the center of a legacy that would bloom like a wildflower through the cracks of the stone forever. The journey that began with a rusted tin box and a heart full of shadows has blossomed into a beacon of light that no mountain storm could ever extinguish. Arthur's story is a profound reminder that our deepest wounds do not have to be our end. Instead, they can become the very foundation upon which we build a sanctuary for others. In the quiet strength of the rooted rock and the unwavering loyalty of a German Shepherd, we find the truth that healing is a communal act. We are never truly alone when we have the courage to reach out, to stack one stone of hope upon another, and to listen to the silent wisdom of the nature that surrounds us. This sanctuary is more than just stone and mortar. It is a miracle of the human spirit. Miracles aren't always found in grand spectacles. More often, they are tucked away in the small, everyday graces, the warmth of a sun-drenched stone, the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a loyal dog, and the unexpected kindness of a neighbor. It is through God's grace that our broken pieces are gathered and repurposed into something far more beautiful and resilient than they were before. He places the right companions in our path and the right purpose in our hearts to remind us that every life, no matter how scarred, is a masterpiece in progress. A message of hope and blessing. As you walk through your own daily battles, remember that you carry the strength of the mountains within you. If you are feeling lost or weary, look for the small stone sanctuaries in your own life, the people who love you, the animals that stay by your side, and the quiet moments of faith that whisper of a better tomorrow. God has not forgotten you, and He has a purpose for your pain, just as He did for Arthur. If Arthur and Cooper's journey touched your heart today, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that they are loved. Drop a comment below with a "God bless" or share your own story of healing. We read every single message and pray for this community daily. May God's light shine upon you. May His peace, which surpasses all understanding, guard your heart. And may He bless you and your family with the strength to build your own sanctuary of love and hope. God bless our veterans, our loyal K9s, and God bless you all.